Welcome to Real Estate and Murder, a podcast about real estate and murder.
I am Amy Brockbank.
And I am Sarah Brager. We are both licensed real estate agents in the state of Utah who have a common fascination with true crime.
We are here to tell you stories of murder amongst the real estate community. It might be an agent, it might be a client, it might be an undetected serial killer.
When it comes to real estate crimes, some are predators and some are prey.
We just want to issue a trigger warning. The content of these cases can be difficult to hear from time to time, and please listen with care.
Okay, everybody. Hi there, Amy.
Hey, Sarah.
Welcome back. We are covering today part 2 of our case coverage on the horrific murder of Carolyn Horton Rogers, a real estate agent from Roanoke, Virginia, who was murdered in October of 1990.
Yeah.
So in part 1, of course, you have to listen to part 1 because we talk about the crime scene and we talk about the suspects who have now been apprehended, if you will. Danny King and Becky King have been arrested in Ohio. So just over the state border, not too far. They hadn't gotten very far, but they were discovered in stolen vehicle.
I mean, there are several states in between Virginia and Ohio.
Well, you know what, Amy? I'm not sure anymore. I'm going to be honest with you. In my now late 30s, thanks to my recent birthday, there's a lot of geography that I am challenging my 5th grade education on. You know what I'm saying? I thought I knew exactly where Kansas was. And also, you can see parts of Russia from Alaska. So I really have no context for where in the world we are. But I mean, they only made it into Ohio over the state border because they're caught immediately on that interstate. They're parked in a rest stop and they're in a stolen vehicle. So obviously there's APBs out and there's warrants out for both of these people.
Well, yeah. Well, Danny, I don't know if Danny had a warrant, but it was a parole violation when they ran it.
Yeah, a parole violation. It's like if you're violating parole, you're immediately up. You immediately have a warrant out for your arrest.
That's true, I guess.
And then
unless they didn't know that he had, it's like they didn't know he was missing until they found him.
Yeah, they probably didn't. And because the police who find the stolen vehicle are lucky to discover that Becky King is in this vehicle and she has a warrant out for first-degree murder.
Yeah.
And so Danny, they were probably processing both of them. Now it comes up, oh, Danny, you're on parole violation too. Perfect. We get to take both of you in.
Yeah.
So they're extradited back to Virginia. And now is the part of the case, we have to do a whole kind of segment on just this part of it because from here, the trial process, the way that these two go through the trial and the results of the trial are so fascinating and complex. It kind of takes Carolyn's story even further. Now, we mentioned in part 1 that unfortunately, in this case, we just don't know very much about Carolyn's personal life.
I do have to make a correction from part 1. I said her name before was Carolyn Horton Jeffers, and it's actually Carolyn Horton Jeffries.
So, Jeffries.
Sorry about that.
Okay. So we do know a little bit about her family life. She was married, had 2 children. We do know those basics. But again, this is a 55-year-old woman in 1990. So she wasn't on Insta.
Yeah.
She wasn't on social media. We just know very little about her. And so this part 2 coverage is going to be mostly of the trial and the case details. But we are telling the story as a part of kind of the punishment that these 2 criminals receive in exchange for something horrific that they did to this lovely woman.
Well, and we have more documentation on them than we normally do because we don't only just have the appeals. We always have appeals docs that we're able to find and court docs and things like that. But there was this application for executive clemency because Danny King is trying to get off of death row. And so we have pages and pages and pages of docs detailing the crime and different things like that we normally don't have, which is unfair for our victim as far as the life that she led before this. But that's the information we have.
Yeah. So let's go back. All right. Let's just tell timeline a little bit because now we got to talk about Becky and Danny's kind of previous crimes and why they get to be where they're at. But the record shows that on October 1st of 1990, so 10 days before Carolyn's murder, King was released on parole from imprisonment for a prior offense. So you were mentioning that he was violating parole, but he had only been out
For 10
for
freaking
10 days.
Like, that's ridiculous.
10 days. And he was in a bigamous marriage with Becky, which they had been married in January of 89. So between January of 89 and October to 1990, he served some type of sentence, unless, I do not know, unless they had this bigamous marriage happen while he was imprisoned.
Yeah, which
Right? I don't know.
Danny King has a history of getting involved in marriages and relationships while he's in prison.
Right, that is true. So at this time that he enters into this bigamous marriage, he is actually married still to a woman named Gail. And he and Gail have a daughter. I do not know anything more about them, and I wasn't going to research that part of the story since this is about Carolyn. But he has a family, and now he's gone on the run with a woman, and they are now both going to be charged with murder. So after the police are getting their stories and speaking to both of them separately, now Danny was involved in the murder.
Well, I mean, this is where all of the controversy kind of comes up, right? Like, Danny will eventually claim that he asked for a lawyer, that the police held him on his violation of parole, but while they were collecting evidence and didn't actually charge him with murder, they had charged Becky, but that he is on the parole violation and that they aren't granting him a lawyer until they actually charge him with the murder. So there's
Right.
like 3 or 4 months that he's in this not really charged, but he's being arrested. He's arrested and held because of
Yeah.
the parole violation.
Okay, so let's go back to the crime scene then. Because when Carolyn's body was discovered, unfortunately, it was such a brutal, violent death. We want to talk about this with respect, of course, but it's relevant to the charges that then happened from here. Because as of now, Becky has been charged with the murder, and police are looking for evidence to also charge Danny because he was clearly there. And we know this because, so unfortunately, and again, I want to tell this part with, reverence and respect, but trigger warning a little bit here. This is violent. Carolyn was choked so hard that fingernail scratches were actually left on her throat. She was beaten so brutally that blood vessels in her eyes burst. I mean, it's making me sick to even say it.
Yeah.
And
we don't usually give these kind of details, so maybe we'll just say at the end of the day that the official cause of death from the coroner's report is a single stab wound to the chest, but there was multiple stab wounds and head trauma.
Yep. So, and I have to unfortunately bring up the head trauma because this is where we can tie Danny King into the crime scene now. The footprints that match Danny King's black leather boots
So the
are
tread
on her head.
marks.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So police can now at this point tie Danny King directly to the crime.
Wow.
So here's where stuff goes haywire, and here's where Sarah gets really angry. In part, these two have been separated now. Becky and Danny are completely separated. So now they're telling completely different stories, okay?
Yeah. Well, it's a he said, she said.
It absolutely is.
Because at the end of the day, they're both trying not to be responsible for the murder.
Exactly. So Danny King's stories go absolutely wild. So how about I tell you a little bit about Becky first?
Okay.
So Becky actually wants to defend herself and say that she had nothing to do with the murder, okay, even though her fingerprint was found, right? Like she wants to say that she didn't commit the murder itself. And I'll explain why in just a second here.
How about we, like, for our audience who may not know this story, say that Becky is now claiming that she is an abused spouse.
Yes.
And she's using Danny King's abusive background that he had growing up as evidence that he now is abusing her and that she willingly took no part in this situation, that she is also a victim.
Right. It's kind of the typical, like you said, he said, she said thing. However, Becky was very clearly the one cashing the checks and pawning the ring. And so she was
Well, and scheduling the
so
appointment.
obviously involved.
Like, let's just say scheduling the appointment. And her fingerprints are in Carolyn's car with her notepad. So,
Right.
I mean, Becky's in deep.
Becky is involved. And in order to get out of it, here's the story she tells. Now, she is referenced from here on out as Becky Smith. That was either her maiden name or a name that she went back to after she no longer called herself King.
Yeah.
But since it was a bigamous marriage, I don't know that it was ever a valid name change in the first place. But if I happen to slip and say Smith, that is Becky. This is as the trial is going on.
Well,
Okay.
I mean, and her lawyer probably came up with this idea because let's separate you as far away from this gentleman as
Yeah.
I can, because, and I say gentleman, like
Not respectfully.
yeah, not that he is a gentleman or anything, but
Right.
he's this guy, but
So Becky testifies at Danny's trial. So his trial, she's there and she testifies and says that she went out for a smoke during the home showing, which is ridiculous. In the middle of a home showing, you stepped out to take a cigarette? Come on. And that when she came back into the room, Danny was standing over Carolyn, bloodied and with a knife.
so let me ask you this.
Yes.
Did Becky's trial happen before Danny's trial?
Chronologically, I don't know because they were tried for completely different things.
Okay.
So I will get to that in 1 second. But she continues to testify at King's trial that he then stripped her naked.
Strip Becky naked.
Yes. Tied her up, put her in the van, and forced her to use a yellow plastic bucket as a toilet.
Okay. So let me get this straight.
Yes.
She schedules the showing.
Uh-huh.
He's recently out of prison.
Uh-huh.
They have no money to buy a house because he's been
Yep.
out for 10 days.
Yep.
So he doesn't have a work history to go
Real.
and purchase a house, because we all know that there's,
Sure.
you know, you have to prove that you can buy the house.
Sure.
I'm assuming they don't have a down payment to buy the house, so they're not going to pay cash. So they're going to go look at a house that she has scheduled, and then she is looking in the house that she and Danny might move into, but in the middle of the showing decides that she needs a smoke, goes outside, comes back in the house,
Uh-huh.
finds out that Danny has killed her,
Uh-huh.
and then she's somehow stripped up all of her clothing, whether inside the house or inside the van, and then held in the van for a period of time where she would need to use the bucket for
Yep.
a bathroom.
Mhm.
Is that
This is her story. Yeah.
okay?
Is that King stripped her naked, tied to humiliate her, in theory, right? Tied her up in the van, forced her to use this bucket for a bathroom, choked her, and compared the color of her face to that of Carolyn's, and said, as he ran the murder weapon blade up and down her body, that she would be next. And then at some point, while all of this is happening and they're driving to Ohio, Becky, fully clothed, jumps out of the van, goes to the bank, cashes 3 forged checks, and pawns Carolyn's ring. So we're telling a
Probably
completely different story.
under duress or whatever. And also, didn't she say that during the trial that Danny got some sort of sexual gratification from Carolyn's murder, and that was kind of why he was attacking Becky? I read that in the transcript.
Absolutely could be. Really, the stories that these two tell from this point on are just...
And this is like one of many. This is one of many that they all tell.
Mhm.
And the discrepancies
are huge.
Yeah, they don't come up with the same story and then change a little minor detail. It's like a completely different story every time they tell it.
It is. And I kind of want to, if it's okay with you, wrap up the Becky part for a minute here so that we can get into Danny, because we have a problem. Prosecutors, right? They have a problem on their hands because at least at this time, again, we did not take the time to research current Virginia laws. We just do not have the time to do that for every case that we do. But at the time, so I don't know if this rule is still in existence, okay? But back in 1990, there was a rule in place called the Triggerman rule.
Yes.
So let's talk about that briefly, because I do know just from, how much true crime I listen to and read and watch, right, that there are a lot of states that say now if there are more than one person involved in a murder, they can all be charged for the murder.
Which would make sense. Like,
It does make sense.
you have a murder that takes place and there's multiple people. You're like, yes, like, they should all be charged for that murder.
But here's the problem, Amy. This Triggerman rule states that if there are multiple defendants in a capital murder case, so it has to be capital murder, and the prosecutors want to take this capital murder.
Yeah, they
which
want
is
the
good.
death penalty on the table.
They do. And because of that, if there's multiple defendants in a capital murder case, only the person who inflicted the fatal wound can be put to death.
Yeah, which is why the coroner had to put that there was a single stab wound to the chest
Right.
that ended up killing her, even though there was all of this other horrific things that happened to her, because the prosecutors now have to show what one person.
Yep.
And I think that this will bring up an interesting discussion for our audience. And please let Sarah and I know your thoughts on this.
Respectfully.
Yeah.
Comment. You can email. We have social medias. Look, we're working on making the social medias more interactive and interesting. But this is a topic to definitely be discussed with care, of course. But the death penalty is like the most controversial topic in true crime, right?
Yeah.
Crime. I guess all crime's true in a way, but you know what I'm saying. It's a hot topic for sure. And
Well, but just the details of this case and what ends up happening, like, I would like to hear everyone's opinion on it. I mean, we weren't responsible for it. We weren't the judge. We weren't the jury. We weren't
of course.
lawyers.
So let's give a little bit more detail, though. Let's talk a little bit more about the Triggerman. So because the prosecution wants the death penalty on the case, they cannot charge both people with the murder of Carolyn Rogers because it's capital murder.
Yeah.
So if one person is going to be put to death for the murder of Carolyn Rogers, only one person can be tried for it.
Yeah.
That's the complication in this case.
And this is where Becky's lawyers, the lawyer's job is to try to fight for their client.
Sure.
But Becky's lawyers argue that, one, Becky wasn't in the basement. And that, two, Becky wouldn't have been strong enough to get the weapon, the knife, in to her chest and commit the fatal wound, because in their eyes, Carolyn's fatal stab wound had to go through a rib. And so you had to have someone that was big and strong to insert the knife far enough into her body.
Wow. So I did just Google it really quickly to see if I could get a real quick answer. And here's the update.
Okay.
The Triggerman rule is still in place in Virginia. However, in 2012, the legislation met and they passed House Bill 389, redefinition of the Triggerman rule and penalty.
Okay.
So the update says now it redefines the Triggerman rule, which currently provides, this is in 2012, currently provides that only the actual perpetrator of a capital murder is eligible for the death penalty, and that accessories and principals in the second degree can be punished only as if guilty of first-degree murder. So an accessory could be charged with second-degree murder, but not capital murder, okay?
But could they be charged with first-degree murder? Because first-degree murder is like premeditated?
Only if they're only as if guilty of first-degree murder.
Okay,
So, like,
if they are guilty of first-degree murder, they're only charged
just
as second
second.
degree. Okay, I'm understanding.
Yep, yep. So this bill, House Bill 389, allows for the principals in the second degree and accessories, so that would be Becky in this case, right? Before the fact to be charged as principals in the first degree in the cases of murder for hire, murder involving a continuing criminal enterprise, and terrorism. This bill allows, in all other cases of capital murder, a principal in the second degree to be tried as a principal in the first degree if he had the same intent to kill as the principal in the first degree.
So break it down for...
So this alteration now states that instead of just, so previously, right, the second degree and the accessory, so we'll just say the accessory to the murder, okay? The accessory could be charged just like the first degree charge in cases only of murder for hire, murder involving a criminal enterprise, and terrorism. So let's look at a murder for hire plot where I hire you to kill my husband, right? So in that case...
Don't worry, Travis, I'm not going to for you.
Promise, babe. It's just an example. Sorry. But in this example, the accessory could be charged for first degree because they had the same intent, right?
Okay.
However, now this bill allows in all cases of capital murder, regardless of motive or designation, right, that the principal in the second degree can be tried as the principal in the first degree if they have the same intent to kill, which Becky did.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that they add that there's 3 options and one of them is terrorism because of the close proximity, I'm sure, to Virginia with after 9/11. Like, a lot of things have changed.
As they should have.
In U.S. law.
Absolutely. Just to kind of nicely wrap this up in the last sentence here, this bill allows an accessory to be tried as a principal in the first degree if he or she ordered or directed the willful, deliberate, and premeditated killing. So now, while this trigger man rule still applies in terms of the capital murder punishment and death penalty, now this bill has allowed for the accessory to also be charged as a principal in the murder.
Interesting.
So that is a good modification that has been made. That was the 2012 session. And again, that's House Bill 389. If you want to take a look at that, I will put the show notes in there. And if we absolutely just slaughtered that explanation.
Yeah, we're not lawyers.
We're not lawyers. Not at all. Yeah. I really was just reading it to you straight from the House bill. So, but what we do know, no matter how I maybe poorly described that or read that, what we do know is now that law has changed and been modified so that if this had happened back at the time, Becky could have been charged in the same way.
Yeah.
So, but that is not the case here, unfortunately. Back to Becky and Danny, prosecutors have to decide who are we going to charge for the capital murder punishment, like who for the death penalty, right?
Yeah.
And they ultimately pick Danny King.
Well, partly because, and this is Danny King's claim with his clemency, is that Becky, because she was charged with the murder, she had a lawyer. She was granted a lawyer pretty early on. Danny is sitting in jail on a parole violation, and they wait 3-4 months, and Danny's claiming that the evidence that the state used against him to prove that he was actually the trigger man, quote unquote, even though there wasn't a gun involved in this case, but that's what the state law calls it, is because he was talking to Becky's lawyers, and Becky's lawyers were recording the conversation and providing that because their job is to defend their client.
Oh, Danny absolutely did this to himself. He told so many varying versions of the story even before he went to trial that it makes sense logically if they had to pick one or the other, that the guy that's all over the place with lies and telling different versions would probably be considered the easier target, right? Like,
well, and this wasn't given in evidence, but the police knew this because of the fact that there was a sheriff's brother who was murdered years before, and Danny was a suspect in that murder. He was never charged, but his name had been circulating. So I think from the detectives, prosecution, all of these guys, they're like, listen, he is maybe in their eyes, Becky was a lesser of two evils.
Mm-hmm.
And so they are like, he's been involved in these crimes before or alleged crimes before. Like, let's get him behind bars because
Totally.
he's only out 10 days and committing or present during.
Vicious crime.
Yes.
Yeah. So let's wrap up Becky really quick because I hate her. So the jury, a jury in Roanoke County decides they can't find Smith, again referenced as Becky Smith now, directly responsible for the murder. So instead, they convict her of being an accessory after the fact for forging the checks and pawning Rogers' ring, says Rogers.
So basically, they don't charge her at all for any of the crime that happened to Carolyn.
She's an accessory after the fact.
Yeah, she's only charged for the petty theft.
So she's convicted of being an accessory after the fact of murder, and the reason that they find that is because she is the one who pawned the ring and forged the checks. However, let's slap Becky with a fair sentence, right? She should be charged fair. She was present for all this. She set it up.
Yeah.
But remember, they're only charging her for being an accessory. So Becky gets the long, long sentence that she deserves of 5 years in prison.
No, and this is the kicker. Like, Sarah's being sarcastic.
Like, super sarcastic, guys.
Those that don't know Sarah, like, she's sarcastic in that remark, but she only ends up serving less than 2 years.
She is paroled in October of 1992. October would have been 2 years to the date of Carolyn's murder. So she served, jail time in between that and the trial, yes, but she got what I couldn't even call a slap on the wrist.
Yeah.
Not even a slap. Like,
yeah.
and this part upsets me for several reasons. Now, and I want to separate out because we want to comment intelligently on these cases, right? If in fact she was only charged with accessory and this is the sentence that is proper according to Virginia law at the time, then I guess she got what she was charged for. However, in my personal opinion, the fact that she called those agents, and let's be clear, she had written down in her handwriting and with her fingerprint on the notepad 3 different agents' names. And they allegedly had gone around and collected these names from bus stop signs, just marketing signs.
For sale signs. Yeah, that on properties.
And they wrote down 3 of them. And you don't go on not very often, I guess, but go drive around one cul-de-sac and there's 3 different houses for sale by 3 different agents. Not very often. So they had to have done some driving. They had to have done some legwork to collect 3 names. To me, that amount of premeditation, whether it was for aggravated robbery or not, she was involved in a way that seems like the punishment should be far more than 5 years, much less the fact that she was paroled in 1992. Like, that part,
2 years after.
It just upsets me. But I want to wrap Becky up a little bit, unless you have anything else to add to Becky specifically right now.
Yeah, I just at the end of the day, I don't buy the abused spouse. And I'm not saying that people can't not do things that are in a situation of abuse. He had been out for 10 days.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yeah. Well, and they entered this bigamous marriage in 1989. This crime happened in 1990. So how well did you really know this person if he then served prison time in between that, the time that you're married illegally to the time that you commit this heinous crime? You're right. Like, there's
And then
Objectively, there's not enough
yeah.
time for that.
And then you cash the checks, and while you're in the bank, you're not telling the bank officers like, "Hey, I'm with a crazy person who just brutally murdered an innocent 55-year-old lady."
Exactly.
Like, it multiple, and they went to multiple banks. It wasn't just like they cashed
Yeah.
one check.
Right.
And I the evidence just doesn't line up for me as far as, like, her story goes, and the fact that her story changed so many times, and that they just took Carolyn's life without any thought. Like, there was no reason, like, if you're going to rob someone, like, C Carolyn would have been like, "Here, have my checkbook. Here, have my ring," like,
Sure.
whatever. Like,
Sure.
to end her life and to end it so brutally,
Yeah.
it was just it's so unnecessary.
Now, if at this point in the story you disagree with us, totally fine. Table that for later because we're going to bring it back up at the end and give you one more reminder. Obviously, there have been cases, there are cases that I've studied, listened to, watched in which that is true that, a woman is being held, and is sort of forced to participate in whatever way. Like that does happen.
Yeah, no, 100% that does. I just don't think that the evidence supports
It
that that's what happened here.
it certainly doesn't, and we will keep talking about that. But let's shift over to Danny because we haven't even tapped the surface of crazy quite yet. I will just note Danny's first wife, at least first that we know of, was a woman by the name of Gail. She actually testifies at his trial. I'm not sure why, but she testifies at his trial that he was a wonderful husband and father up until the point that he met Becky and started using drugs and alcohol and then got into a full-blown relationship, bigamous marriage with Becky, was charged with something in which he served prison time. We do not have a record of that necessarily, but it, I don't know how much weight Gail's testimony should have in considering this case, but she testified that there was kind of a point where he broke off and went dark.
I think she was a character witness, and I also think at the end of the day, whether she liked him or not for what he did for her, I can see someone going in and trying to clear the name for your child. Like, I don't want my child to have this be who her father is.
Mm.
You know what I'm saying? Like, not that she would have had all the details of what the two of them did, but I can see her trying to be like, he's not, I didn't know that person. Because we talk about this with BTK too. His family, his daughters, like his kids, like they're like, we were totally blindsided with who he was. And I think that him doing this is just so out of the norm for who she thought he was that I think she was just like, no, this can't possibly be without this woman or these drugs or this alcohol or whatever. But plenty of people do drugs and alcohol and don't go and commit horrific crimes.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's Becky. That's Gail testifying. Yeah, I'm just saying I don't know how much weight should be given to it in our conversation because he's clearly a monster in so many ways. But let's jump into his
I was gonna say, let's tell the audience
his
like
trial.
what he's kind of claiming and what he's not claiming and how his story has changed over time.
Yeah, so his story, I mean, there are times in which he admitted flat out to lawyers and in Becky's trial that he was guilty and she had nothing to do with it.
Yeah. And he claims that he was trying to save her from the gas chamber. Which I don't know if
By changing his story?
Yeah.
Right.
If Virginia has a gas chamber, but that's what he was claiming.
So his story changes multiple times and in completely different directions. But, at trial, they do bring in a forensic psychologist.
Yeah.
Their name is Dr. Moody. And they testify that King was not likely to pose a threat or danger to anyone if he's incarcerated. I know.
I mean, how many people would fit that bill?
I know.
You're not a threat, but we're gonna, when you're incarcerated, you're not a threat.
Right,
Like,
exactly.
what is that? What statement is that?
And testified that King would not pose a continuing threat to society if he were confined in prison. So I think what this forensic psychologist is getting at, and it was probably brought in by the defense. I do not know for sure, but I think what they're trying to get at is that he could live the remainder of his life in prison and not have to have the death penalty.
Okay.
So, right, they're
That means
arguing
he's not a threat to the population inside the prison.
exactly
Okay,
that
I
if
see.
he's incarcerated, he's not a threat, but also, like, do we really have to kill him?
Okay,
Kind of,
I
right?
see.
And Dr. Moody also states that King's prison record demonstrated that Danny King was kind of a model prisoner. So, whatever. But I think, again, that was likely brought in by the defense to say, we don't have to kill this guy, right?
Yeah.
And again, the death penalty is a very controversial subject. So, I get if you're kind of defending your position on it. But, also as a part of the trial, evidence of substantial childhood abuse is brought in.
Yeah, which we had kind of mentioned earlier
Right.
that Becky was trying to use as well, saying that he had this horrific upbringing and he became this flawed person.
Mhm.
And that is why he's violent and does these
Mhm.
things to women.
Well, and again, so King's mother actually comes and gives detailed testimony
Yeah.
at his trial and says that he was excessively beat by his father, that there was verbal abuse, emotional abuse.
Well, she also puts him as a hero in this, that he did that in order to save her from the abuse of the father, that he has always been the protector.
So that Danny, are you saying Danny stood in between them, kind of a thing? Okay.
Yes.
Um, so there's a lot of verbal abuse. She stated that the abuse began all the way back when Danny was a baby and continued throughout the childhood. So again, the psychiatrist, Dr. Moody, brings this up and discusses this and points to the abuse as a likely source of Danny's inclination towards violence, but says that because of it, because of how and where that originated, it should be treatable.
Okay, so that he can be rehabilitated.
Again, yes,
Okay.
that's my understanding would be that they're trying to prove that he doesn't have to receive the death penalty. So, and then Danny, of course, he wants to state that the story's changed multiple times, but he was doing it honorably, that he was trying to help Becky, which is like none of your business. Stay out of that part of the trial. Like,
Yeah.
just stay in your own trial. But
He actually does himself a disservice and digs himself a hole. And Becky also, in the course of all of this, her story has changed so many times and the evidence doesn't always line up with their crazy stories, you know?
no, it definitely does not.
Because Danny claims that he stepped outside and that because Becky was in the showing, they went down in the basement and that she ended up having this evil look on her face or whatever and told him after the fact that she had stabbed and killed Carolyn.
Right. So his story is that he went outside. She stayed inside. Now, I did have a thought earlier, and I wasn't able to find any information on this, but I would love to know if Becky's story is true, that she's the one that stepped out for a cigarette.
Is there a cigarette outside?
I would like to know if a cigarette was found at the scene
Yeah.
or in the vehicle, because how did they dispose of it?
Yeah.
Right? They approached the showing, from what we understand, on foot because they didn't have a vehicle. They took Carolyn's vehicle to escape. And so either they had ditched a different stolen vehicle or just Becky drove Carolyn's vehicle away. Either way, a cigarette butt would have been found somewhere, right?
See, and that's another thing that Becky's story doesn't line up is that she says she was the one that drove the vehicle at Danny's request to the mall. At any time, you're driving this woman's car. Like, go to the police station, do something, get help. Like, you're driving this, you're away from the person who supposedly is abusing you. And they just committed this horrific crime. Like, you have an opportunity to get away.
Absolutely. But the cigarette, it lingers in my head, like, where is
Yeah.
the cigarette butt, if in fact that's true? So anyway, I didn't mean to tie Becky back into it, but I brought it up because now Danny's saying that he was the one that went outside, which means she didn't go outside for a cigarette,
Yeah,
now
and
it changes.
both of them change like how they met up with each other. But at the end of the day, like whether, you know, they're like, oh, we met up with each other in the house or at the top of the stairs, or, you know, like there's all these different stories of how he said, she said ended up happening. But the crime was so horrific and there was head wounds, and head wounds bleed so much.
Mm-hmm.
So someone is covered in blood.
There's evidence somewhere. Like, we'll definitely like tie back to the crime scene one more time, but there's just all these missing pieces still, you know?
Yeah.
However, Danny King is found guilty, rightfully so. He's found guilty of
Capital murder.
capital murder, and he is sentenced to death.
Yeah.
So, you'd think this is over. It's not over, folks.
Really quick, we had briefly mentioned about a sheriff's brother who was killed. So we're just going to
Right.
give our audience just a brief little backstory about the murder of this individual. His body has never been found, and his name is Gene McPherson. And the sheriff was B.B. McPherson. And so he's attending Danny's trial, and he's very interested. There is a man that was serving jail time. He was already serving a life sentence plus 156 years. His name was John Colclasure, if I'm saying it correctly. And he ended up pleading guilty to the killing in 1989 is when he said McPherson had died. And basically his story is that he was paid by a man whose wife was having an affair with Gene. And so this man paid, it was a murder for hire, paid John to go kill Gene. And John and Danny King lived in the area, knew each other, had some drug dealings or whatever involved. And the police are speculating that John and Danny killed Gene and then disposed of his body together. And so the sheriff is at Danny's trial, and when Danny is found guilty of not only capital murder, but also the jury finds in favor of the death penalty, the sheriff is very pleased. He feels like the judge shouldn't have gone easy on Danny because he's hoping that Danny will then try to leverage information and say, like, I will lead you to this body if you remove the death penalty or whatever, because the family's wanting closure. So the sheriff is pleased that he got this maximum sentence that goes on. And I don't know if he's the sheriff then or of this county. It just says he was a sheriff. So just for our audience to know.
Right.
But Danny's clemency docs, he's claiming a lot of things.
Okay, so Danny King is suggested to be involved in another murder as well, potentially. And so, there's all these moving parts, but also as a part of the changing of the storytelling that he goes through, he mentions this whole other story, which you could find on Murderpedia, which was a great source for us both. But Danny tries to say that Carolyn's murder was a hitman, right? That tied to the Hells Angels.
Well, and
motorcycle club.
He also, I forgot about this, he also claims that, or Becky claimed, I'm not sure which one claimed because the multiple stories, claimed that Carolyn's son owed money for drugs.
Right.
And that Danny was supposed to go and get the money for the drugs, and that's why she was murdered, was for her son.
Right, so Danny's telling this other wild story about, drug deal gone wrong.
Murder for hire.
Murder for hire. He states that he was a member of the Hells Angel motorcycle gang, which is ridiculous, probably pretty easy to disprove. And that Carolyn's murder was a contract killing, which was set up while he was in prison. Okay, so before he got out, remember, he got out on October 1st.
The 10 days
1990, yep. So he says that at that point, a guy named Smokey contacted him and asked him to, murder this real estate agent at a vacant house. And the Carolyn's checking account would essentially, pay for the murder for hire. So I need you to go murder this woman. And if you steal her checking account information, you can be paid with everything in that account.
Which is
Amy's just shaking her head at me.
yeah, the money trail is just ridiculous.
And so he's telling now this wild story with this whole other person named Smokey involved who was also supposed to be present at the murder, but wasn't. And there's no proof of any of this. But we're just adding all the layers to this wild storytelling that he's doing. One more quick story that we'll throw in. I don't have a lot of information on this, but Danny King is now saying that he has a second personality that he calls the deacon. Like the deacon, like a religious figure, right?
Yeah.
Which has to be, quote, put back in his place on occasion. And that the deacon whispered to him and told him he had to commit this murder.
So what's funny about, and there's nothing funny about multiple personalities if your loved one is really suffering with that.
Mm-hmm.
But Danny King's mother accused Becky King of having multiple personalities in the trial because she said when she stayed with his mother while Danny was in prison and being after he was convicted and all that stuff, she lived with Danny's mother. And Becky would often talk about her different personalities that would come up. And so Danny's mother was convinced that Becky was the real killer because of all of these multiple personalities. And one of them was named Draconian or whatever it is. So
multiple personality disorder, something that's wildly misunderstood and misused in the media and in storytelling and stuff like that. But in all reality, that's very, very rare.
yeah.
Very, very uncommon. And this is just, Danny has threaded so many lies into this story that it's not something the police really showed any interest in pursuing that story.
And at the end of the day, they were both involved in drugs. So I'm sure someone on drugs has a very different personality than someone that's not on drugs.
Very true.
So, right then and there, like I'm not sure what kind of drugs they were taking, but you could act totally different when you're under the influence than when you're not.
That's a good point.
So,
that is very true.
It might all be factual, but not actually medically diagnosed, because if these would stop using the drugs, then they would be in their right mind all the time.
Good point. So just to wrap up the trial here, Carolyn's husband, Chet Rogers, so you mentioned his full name back at the beginning in episode 1. Chester was actually his middle name, but he went by Chet. So Chet attended the trial, and he was fuming at Danny King's lies and stories, especially the part about a drug debt being involved with his son.
Yeah.
That was very offensive, obviously. And Chet was quoted as saying, that he was very pleased with the results of the trial, but that there was truly never going to be real justice, and that even though Danny King was at this point set to be executed, that it really served him no purpose to go to the execution because there was never really going to be justice.
Yeah, and justice will never be served for the victims' families.
Absolutely valid. Yeah. And Chet, fortunately, later in his life, he was able to move on. He moved away from Roanoke. He remarried, and hopefully had a good life after that. But also, we do just want to note that at the trial, Amy, there were 40 real estate agents present.
Yeah, and they were all flabbergasted with his excuses and differing stories, and audibly it notes in the court docs that they were audibly upset.
So it says here, one real estate agent groaned when King denied that he had killed Rogers, and my immediate thought was, that would so be me. I would get, because you're supposed to be silent in court, right? And you could be removed if there's commotion or you're interrupting the trial. But I can totally see myself sitting there and being like,
yeah.
4-letter words coming out of mouths.
But I think it's absolutely beautiful that 40 real estate agents attended. Trial is hard to attend. And especially this case,
The brutality.
the brutality of it must have been very hard to swallow, as you're sitting there being faced with the evidence. But I do just want to note that in most of these stories that we've told, there's kind of been a beautiful follow-up to it about how the real estate community reaches out. Like the Mike Emmert case, the real estate community raised money. They also changed some of the laws in Washington. And there's several cases like that. And in the case of Rosemary Christensen, the real estate community, raised money to help for a reward and were also present during and after and still telling their stories. So this is just another example that the real estate community tight-knit, and that these people wanted to be present for Carolyn, to represent Carolyn at this trial. And so I think that was a beautiful thing to note. I'm glad that we were able to find that in the little bits of information we could find. So
Yeah.
So back to the week of the execution that's set, right? July 23rd, 1998. We do want to know we're only 8 years past the date of this crime, which is a pretty quick timeline comparatively to other, death penalty cases that we've studied and discussed. So this process is actually moving pretty quick. And like I had said all the way back at the beginning in part 1, the governor is reviewing once again Danny's clemency.
And let's just remind our audience, because we've given them a lot of random stories. At the end of the day, there's physical evidence. And Danny is claiming a lot of things for his clemency docs. His lawyers have found 2 jurors that have come forward and said that if they knew that at sentencing, Danny could receive a longer sentence to serve, they thought he was going to be able to be out in just a few years. And they were like, well, he would have served until he was in his 70s or just barely 70. So they're like, maybe we wouldn't have given him the death penalty had we known that for most of his life he would have served the prison sentence. Danny's lawyer is also saying that he was denied a lawyer for several months to begin with. That the jury didn't, in fact, convict him and agree that he was the sole or the trigger man, as we've stated, but that, they couldn't really determine who had killed them. But the jury did find him guilty of capital murder. So that to me just says the jury actually agreed that he was the person.
Absolutely.
They weren't allowed to bring in the evidence of his potential involvement in Jean McPherson's disappearance or murder.
Sure.
And so there wasn't.
Makes sense.
Yeah, there wasn't that. But there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 points in this petition for clemency.
Right. But ultimately, like we said, up until 4 hours before the execution is set to take place, the governor denies.
Yeah.
He denies
He denies
the appeal,
the
clemency.
to get off of death row.
Yep. And also in this same week, the U.S. Supreme Court voted 7-2 to deny Danny King a stay of execution.
Yeah.
And a separate appeal that he had made. So it did go to the Supreme Court. It did go all the way to the governor, and the governor denied, up until a 4-hour time window, denied a stay of execution for Danny King. So Danny King died by lethal injection on July 23rd, 1998, 9:04 p.m. The lethal injection process began. It is just noted that Danny King's last visitor before he died was a different woman by the name of also King. I guess she took his name as well. But he had a last visitor, a woman that he also married, apparently.
While he was in jail.
Right? While he was going through this process.
Yeah, I think he probably a jailhouse murder. Danny was 48 when he died. So he was 40 when he killed her. So
yeah, 39 and 36 were the ages of Danny and Becky at the time that they committed this crime. However, like I was saying, his last visitor is a new wife that comes.
Yeah.
to say goodbye, I guess, and she visited the prison between 1 and 3 p.m. that day.
He didn't have, for those that are curious, not that, but a lot of talk is about, like, what their last meal is or whatever, and he opted not to have a last meal.
Yep, he did not have a last meal. I've been searching my notes through here. I believe that his last wife's name was Karen King. Do I have that correct?
I thought it was Kelly, but it doesn't really matter, I guess.
Either way, he had another wife that visited and did not take his last meal, and he dies, like we said, by lethal injection. So he dies. Becky is out and free. I just want to kind of wrap this up, Amy, before we get to our takeaways, though, because this case had such a different result for these two people, right?
Yeah, I mean, one person got less than 2 years and one person got lethal injection.
Right. So, Amy, remember.
Oh, his last visitor, her name is Karen.
Okay. So Karen King is the last person to visit Danny King. We're only mentioning that because somehow this man has just consistently found partners that want to be married to him, and it's odd. But
yeah.
So, Amy, remember the police and how they did an excellent job at the crime scene collecting evidence, right?
Yeah.
And how quickly they were able to track down Danny and Becky because of this. And then remember how Danny's last version of the story, the last version he told of the many, was that Becky had delivered the fatal stab wound to Carolyn's chest.
Yes.
Okay? And
Carolyn Becky had always denied that she even went into the basement. We should just say that. She had always denied that she was in the basement, and that when she went out to smoke her cigarette, she came in the house and met Danny right at the front door. And then another version, she came in the house and met Danny at the top of the stairs.
Mhm.
And then another version, she came in the house and met him halfway up down the stairs. But she swears she was never in the basement.
Right. So Danny's latest version before he's executed is that Becky delivered the fatal stab wound, and Becky is out on, she was released on parole at the time.
Free.
She was sentenced to 5 years. She served less than 2. But remember the evidence that the police found. They found a notepad with Becky's fingerprints on it in the car. As far as I can tell in any of the source material, they did not find a cigarette, although I'd love to know. But there's one more piece of evidence that the police discovered at the crime scene and noted at the time. Bloody footprints that belong to a woman in a woman's shoe.
Around Carolyn's body.
Walking away from the crime scene.
And the police, for our audience, did retrieve the shoes out of a garbage can that had been thrown away, I believe, near the mall. And experts testified at trial that it was consistent with the way that the wear patterns on the shoes were consistent with wear patterns from Becky's shoes.
Mm-hmm.
Becky has denied owning these shoes.
Becky denied wearing shoes.
No, she's just like, those are not my shoes.
I'm joking, but we wanted to kind of tie it up in case you've been doubting us this whole time about our take on Becky's story, Becky's involvement. Just to drop that off at the very end here, there was one more final piece of evidence at the crime scene, which was bloody footprints.
Yeah.
We know Becky was there. So, fascinating criminal case. Of course, it's awful and tragic that Carolyn lost her life so unfairly, and that it truly was just a crime of opportunity. It is noted Barbara Fogel and Cheryl Ham were both quoted in interviews with the press and stuff. They said, both of them, it could have been me.
Yeah.
It could have been any one of us.
Yeah.
Carolyn's name was picked off a sign.
Yeah. A random for sale sign at a house.
Yep. And it could have been any one of us that lost our lives that day because of this just opportunistic crime. So that is the case of Carolyn Horton Rogers' murder. So, Amy, should we do our takeaways? We always do our takeaways at the end of the case. They can be real estate related, crime related, or both. What is
This
your
case
takeaway?
is really frustrating for me because I don't feel justice was served, even though someone received the ultimate justice, right? Like the
Sure.
ultimate punishment, I guess,
Yeah.
is a life for a life.
Right.
Um, and I just think that I'm saddened that we couldn't find more information about Carolyn. We would love to do a follow-up episode, so if you know her or know someone that knows her and would love to talk to us, we'd love to do a follow-up episode of just who she was as a person.
Yeah.
And I think justice was not served for the family in regards to Becky.
It's so true.
Yeah.
It's so true. Even if she had served 20 years, it would be less insulting. 18 years, it would
Yeah,
be
but
less insulting than less than 2 years.
yeah, and I think we've talked about this, like, off mic, is just what Carolyn's husband ended up saying, like, there is no justice. So it doesn't matter if it's 20 years or 30 years or whatever, it's just you took someone's life and they're never coming back. Like, the family is never the same, they have to live with that. Their loved one is gone, but it is insulting that
Yeah.
she got 2 years.
It is. Knowing the evidence we have, we wouldn't say that if there wasn't evidence that's very compelling, right?
Yeah.
Physical evidence.
Well, and part of the physical evidence we didn't mention to our audience is that her wedding ring was forcibly removed from her finger.
Right.
And so just the violence of even just removing her wedding ring and the sheer disregard for human
Yeah.
life was just ridiculous.
It was.
What about yours?
So my takeaway is a little bit more real estate related this time. So I find it so fascinating that there were 40 realtors present at the trial. I think it's absolutely beautiful. What a testament to Carolyn and how much her community cared for her. But my point is, I've been kind of dealing with this thought process all morning as I did my notes. This murder was all the way back in 1990. This is one of the, older cases that we've discussed. Not the oldest, but the, older. And that is proof to me that in 1990, realtors were afraid of this happening to them.
Yeah, they could still fall victim.
They absolutely could. Again, Barbara Fogel, she mentions in one of the articles that she's quoted in that for a couple of weeks after Carolyn's death, if she got a phone call about one of her listings, she would just lie and say it was sold because she was so scared that this type of crime, even though people were arrested for it, would now open up other criminals' thought process and ideas.
Murders.
The copycat of cornering an agent in a vacant home. And so, as we tell all of these stories, a part of, the reason that we thought this podcast subject would be interesting in general as real estate agents was because safety is a huge concern. And my point is that this concern has been in existence for all this time, it's been a long, long time. And that I think there needs to be a heightened awareness of the potential that real estate agents face when they are exposed to cold calling, clients that they don't know, and vacant homes and open houses.
Well, and they had no intention of buying a house. It wasn't like they were really looking for a house. Like, they had no finances, they had no money, like they had nothing. They didn't have a job. They had nothing to be able to purchase a house.
And nowadays we actually even have documents in place that we can enforce that require the potential buyer to meet with us or discuss with us in advance before we meet and show homes.
Yeah.
And I think that that's fantastic, but those documents have now been enforced by law in 2024, not with the intention of helping protect realtors. It's a completely, like, that's just a byproduct of it, right? Like that whole, issue in this paperwork now being required in as a part of like the steps before you see a home was meant for a different purpose.
Yeah.
And secondarily has some layers of protection for us as agents. And so, I find it fascinating that this has clearly been a problem for this long and and we're still exposed. Like we said, this case had hints of Lindsay Buziak in it, meeting people that you don't know at a vacant home. I do just want to know, as I wrap up here, that again, Barbara and Cheryl Ham, who were both interviewed after, had said several times, I would have done the same thing. I would have gone.
Yeah.
I just didn't get the call.
Yeah.
And so real estate agents, when we're doing these things, we're just doing our job. We're doing what we believe our job to be. And there is a heightened risk, and we all need to be hyper aware of that. I hope that this podcast is reaching a lot of women. I hope this podcast is reaching a lot of men real estate agents as well, because they're victims as well. But just putting that safety conscious topic out there, I think, is really important. And I hope our podcast is helping to do that. So
Yeah. That's a great takeaway.
that is the case. Let's wrap it up. And Amy, I'll see you next time for another story.
All right.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.